Regulation has started to come along, so there's some good regulations in certain parts of the country where policy is helping to drive that, and then ultimately, I think consumer sentiment, right? As we all see that the weather patterns are changing, that it's more intense. There's more rainfall. There's more water. There's more events. The public is becoming more interested. In fact, we just did a Harris poll study, and we found that greater than 50% of just the general American population is concerned about stormwater.
Hey everyone, it's Bob Crossan. I'm the editorial director for Wastewater Digest. I'm joined today by Brian King. He is Executive Vice President of Product Management, Marketing, and Sustainability for Advanced Drainage Systems. And we're going to be talking about water recycling and recovery, kind of the advancements over time, and how ADS has fit into that the mold that is being shaped by that. So thank you so much, Brian, for taking your time with us, and welcome to the call.
Thanks. It's great to be here and talk about stormwater water management.
Yeah. So how has the sentiment on water recycling and reuse changed over the past 2 or 3 decades? I know this has been something that folks have talked about for a long time, and you have different perspectives to come at that from, right? You have the industry professionals, you have the general public as well. What is kind of the sentiment, and how has it evolved over that period of time?
I mean, I think if you were to sum it up in, a few words, you would say that people are much more interested in stormwater and how you actually use stormwater as opposed to just, making sure that it doesn't flood your house or your ball field or where you work, right? And so
Mhm.
over the last, 20 or 30 years, if we rewind or go back to that, that was really what the sentiment was 20 or 30 years ago, was just get the stormwater, the rainwater, get it off my property, get it off my project, my development, make sure that you can manage it in a way that makes sense. But as things have evolved, and I think probably more from some of advanced companies, some companies thinking more about sustainability, they started to think about water. They capture it. So what do you do with it? And one thing to treat it and then put it back into the environment. It's another thing to say, okay, I've got this valuable resource. How do I then reuse this in a way that makes sense, either from a cost or financial perspective, from an environmental perspective? Because if you do it right, you hit on
Hmm.
all those factors. And so what we're starting to see now is that as water scarcity in the left side of the country, in the west, has become a big deal. As water, if you look at the right side of the country, there's generally more water than required or needed. And so how do you actually manage that resource, that precious resource? And that's where people are starting to go to. It started, again, like I said, with progressive companies that thought about that from a messaging perspective. Regulation has started to come along, so there's some good regulations in certain parts of the country where policy is helping to drive that. And then ultimately, I think consumer sentiment, right? As we all see that the weather patterns are changing, that it's more intense. There's more rainfall. There's more water. There's more events. The public is becoming more interested. In fact, we just did a Harris poll
Hmm.
study, and we found that greater than 50% of just the general American population is concerned about stormwater.
Oh, I'm not surprised by that at all. The storms seem to have gotten more intense than ever before. The flows are getting so high that wastewater treatment plants especially are having so much trouble trying to deal with this excess flow that frankly they haven't had to deal with like this before.
Right.
And so I think that's it's astute to know that there's actual data that backs up the sentiment that I have witnessed personally as well. So,
Yeah, it's definitely becoming more of the conversation. And again, people are seeing, when people think about water or water management, you tend to think about potable water. What do I drink, right?
hmm.
You think about wastewater and what happens, to wastewater and how is that managed? And we're trying to say that stormwater is sort of that third leg of the stool, that stormwater is part of that entire water management solution. And at ADS, we're definitely into the stormwater piece. We also manage wastewater with our infiltrator business, which is more of an on-site septic or
Hmm.
a decentralized wastewater solution. But all those things working together really are, water management. And what I would say is that we believe the industry is starting to think about all those things together. Think
Yeah.
about how they all work. It's no longer, how do you think about my one part of the problem? It's how do those things all work together, and how do we balance the entire water table, the entire, water system, and make
Mhm.
sure that we're thinking about all parts of water management.
Yeah, it's the whole idea of one water, right? About like breaking down the silos that have traditionally been siloed of drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, and kind of
Yep.
looking at it across the whole cycle and understanding that there's value at every in every style of water, essentially, right? Um,
Exactly. I mean,
so,
it is the most precious resource that we've got, right? Without water,
mhm,
there is no life. And to your point, I mean, and storms and weather are changing. I mean, we set up water tables when you're looking at designing systems, and I know this happens on the wastewater side of things, like you mentioned, on the stormwater side of things, looking at what the weather patterns are like. And the 50-year storm is now the 20-year storm. The 100-year
mhm,
storm is now the 50-year storm.
mhm,
And we've redone those water calculations and those water tables, and I've seen the different government agencies providing that information as well too. We've had more updates in the last 10 years than we've had in the previous 30 years, which is amazing, right? When you think about that. And so when you're designing solutions and when you're designing systems, you have to think about not just what it is today, but also what it's going to be like 20, 40, 50 years in the future. And the patterns are changing, right? So you need to be on top of that. And I think we as an industry are starting to realize that that's a really important piece of data that we have to think about when we
mhm.
design our solutions.
Yeah. You mentioned a couple of drivers already about kind of like the drought out west.
Mhm.
Speaking about like the bigger driver of that whole on water attitude and things like that. What are some other things that you are attributing that sentiment change to around water recycling and recovery?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of reports lately about just, what's happening to the water tables and aquifers,
Hmm.
groundwater use. I actually just read an article, it was in Wired magazine, and it was talking about the fact that the East Coast of the United States, because of the groundwater use that's actually happening, it's actually sinking, right? And it's millimeters.
Hmm.
It's not huge. It's probably not noticeable by the average person walking around. But the actual amount of rain of water that's being pulled out of groundwater is causing the actual levels to sink. And a couple millimeters different means storm surges act and behave differently. Weather as it comes on shore acts and behaves differently. Flooding acts and behaves differently. And so those little things, to your point about everything working together.
Hmm.
And I think it's as we start to see the impacts of what that means around more severe weather changes to the actual physical nature of where we live, and more people starting to live closer to the coast, more people starting to live in cities. It's becoming important when people think about where they live and the quality of life that they have. Um, what happens when it rains, right? Am I going to live in an area that floods? Nobody wants to live there.
Hmm.
There is a social equity piece to it as well, too. I mean, when you see on the news after there's a big storm, it tends to be the areas that flood are the areas that have been historically underdeveloped, right? And so how do we think about that? How do we manage that? How do we think about the total area that we live, and how do we manage that water solution?
Yeah. Well, speaking of management, one of the things I did want to ask you about, and I know ADS has some solutions around this too, but I
Mhm.
know that this goes beyond the scope of just ADS. What are some of the technologies that people are turning to in regards to this? Whether it's water reuse and recycling, whether it's managing this excess flow of stormwater that you're talking about,
Right.
how has that evolved over that same period of time, that past 2 to 3 decades or so?
I mean, we used to tend to think of products. You have pipe, take stuff away, put it into a
Hmm.
pipe. We now think about what we internally refer to as the life cycle of a raindrop, right? So the rain comes down, you have to capture it in some type of basin or drain, right? And we have products which are in that area. You have to convey it away from where you don't want it to where you do want it. There's a storage solution, which for us is an underground retention detention
Hmm.
system. We're not huge fans of retention ponds. They tend to look pretty, but at the same time, there's a whole bunch of negatives that come around with retention ponds. We like to put water underground, especially on a commercial development, so you can use that space above, or if it's a park, you can put a park above it, and engage there. And then you let it back into the environment by treating it. And so we look at capture, convey, store, treat. That's how we think about the
Hmm.
life cycle of a raindrop. And then we make sure that we have products that work together through that train of when the rain drops, falls on the ground, and then eventually it gets back into a lake, river, stream, or watershed, making sure that it's in a quality which is better, hopefully, than what it
Hmm.
actually arrived on the ground first time. And that's what we think about. That's where the products we develop, and that's what, frankly, when people are designing systems, they're thinking about all those different things, right? The engineers who design the systems or retrofit a system, they're looking at how do I manage the water through that life cycle. And so thinking about it less from a product perspective, more from an application and system perspective, has allowed us to, I think, create more comprehensive solutions which address the needs of the customer. And what's happening now, to your point, is that more people are thinking about, okay, if I've stored it and I've captured it, what can I now do with it,
Yeah,
right?
now what?
Releasing it back into groundwater, obviously, like I said, is good, right? A portion of that. But how do I potentially use that? Could I turn it into drinking water? Could it irrigate, the landscape around me? Could I use it within gray water solutions within a building? Those are all things that people are now thinking about.
Yeah, that whole Buffalo approach, right? So,
Yeah, absolutely.
so during that same period of time, is there something that you point to of like, oh wow, this is probably one of the most critical advancements that's really jettisoned us into this next degree of water reuse and recycling? Or is it just kind of a combination of too many things to count?
I mean, I think there's some key drivers around it. I mean, you talked a little bit about it early on, water scarcity that exists on the west side of the country. I mean, how do you when an event happens, how do you actually make sure that you maximize and use that precious resource in such a way that, rather than just letting it run back into the ocean or a lake. And
Mhm.
so I think that's part of it. I think municipalities especially, are starting to see that as a resource. If you look at development and a lot of where the announcements of where, onshoring and a lot of the new warehouse developments, data centers and things like that are happening, they tend to happen in areas that have a good abundant supply of water. And
Mhm.
so it's driving innovation, it's driving, investment, it's driving growth. And so water is becoming a critical thing that people think about when they actually decide to make an investment from a business perspective. And I think that's driving a lot of it, right? It's a lot of where are people living, where are people working, where are we making the investments in infrastructure? And so that all means that we have to think about how we actually use that water. And like I said earlier, right, that the original intent 30 or 40 years ago was just get it away from where I am. Now it's like, wait a second, this is actually a resource. Let's use it.
Yeah, yeah. Like I mentioned, the whole Buffalo approach, using every single drop of that water to
Absolutely
make
right.
to make
Absolutely
use of
right.
it.
I
So,
mean, I mean, the other thing that's happened has been, innovation in materials that are actually being used
mhm.
in the systems, right? I mean, traditional materials like concrete and steel, and you start to think about sustainability and greenhouse gas emissions, and where do you actually make products? And so things like plastic, which gets a little bit of a bad rap, to
Mhm.
be honest. I mean, because people tend to think of plastic as a single-use plastic, something that gets, used once, your Gatorade bottle, and then you kind of, it goes somewhere, hopefully into a recycling bin. We are a solution to that plastics problem. And plastics are lighter, right? So from moving around the country, they use less energy to do that. From a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, they release less greenhouse gas emissions versus concrete and some of the other materials that are out there. And then ultimately they can be recycled, and we use a high amount of recycled content. So one of the questions I get asked all the time in my sustainability role is, what happens when I throw that Tide bottle into my recycling bin? Does it really go and get reused, or does it go
Mhm.
to the landfill? I'm here to tell you that we reuse that and we make that into a durable pipe that can last for 100 years. And so that's a great way, to look at materials and look at sustainability, and then say, how do we make sure that we're using the materials that we have in the best way possible to manage this resource that we want to make sure that we capture and reuse.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Brian. I really appreciate you taking the time and chatting with us about this today. And I definitely learned something something from you, which is always great. So I appreciate the conversation and the candor. And for everybody who's watching, check out our video description below. We'll have some more information down there about ADS and about some of these techniques that he was speaking of. And Brian, once more to you. Thank you for being here.
Hey, thank you very much. Really appreciate the invitation, and really obviously enjoy talking about stormwater. And I think we're all in a great industry. It's something that it's a fun business to be in. And when you talk to people about what you do, and if you're in the water management business, be it potable water, stormwater, or wastewater, everybody knows what's going on. So it's a fun business to be in, and I appreciate the time.
Of course.